Dear students, welcome to the discussion on the most important topic of the year, the questions of the year, AIMS June 2020 questions. Okay, so we're going to discuss some important questions from AIMS 2020, and we're also going to see what other possible questions are there related to that particular topic. Okay, so now see the first question. A 50-year-old patient attends the gynec OPD with history of 2 months of abnormal uterine bleeding. What is the first line of management, or what should be done next? Okay, so her age is 50 years and she has come with 2 months of abnormal uterine bleeding. That means she is not a postmenopausal lady, she is still a menstruating lady. Okay, so for all practical purposes, any bleeding from the genital tract after 50 years would be considered a postmenopausal bleeding, even if she is bleeding continuously. Okay, but for the given question, let us see what the guideline says, how to go with this. Okay, see, in case of abnormal uterine bleeding, okay, in case of abnormal uterine bleeding, okay, now we will first consider the age. Okay, so if the woman is less than 45 years, okay, if the woman is less than 45 years, we can always try medical management first. Okay, we can always try medical management first, provided she is she's not having any high risk factors for endometrial cancer, or she's not a PCOS patient, she's not an obese lady, or she's not been treated for any genital malignancy before, and she's a completely non-high risk case of abnormal uterine bleeding with first episode of abnormal uterine bleeding with an endometrial thickness of less than 12 mm, you can put her on medical management. Okay. Now, if you have to take endometrial biopsy for this patient, what are the indications for endometrial biopsy? Number 1, failed medical management, or number 2, any signs of excess estrogen in the body, any signs of excess estrogen in the body, say for example she has fibroids, or she's been treated for breast cancer, or her endometrial thickness is high, all these. Okay, persistent abnormal uterine bleeding and endometrial thickness of more than 12 mm. Okay, if any of these are present, then the next step would be endometrial biopsy to rule out malignancy. Okay, endometrial biopsy to rule out malignancy. Okay, this is only for a woman who is less than 45 years. Okay, now if the lady is already more than 45 years, okay, then the first step would be to do an endometrial biopsy. Okay, the first step would be to do an endometrial biopsy to rule out endometrial malignancy. Okay, so now this lady, being a 50-year-old lady, irrespective of whether she is a postmenopausal lady or a perimenopausal lady, provided she is more than 45, irrespective of the endometrial thickness, the first step here would be to do an endometrial biopsy to rule out endometrial cancer, and therefore option C is the perfect answer for this question. Okay, endometrial aspiration biopsy. Okay. See the next question here. 38-year-old patient attends the gynec OPD with cervical cytology report as Hetzel. What is the next line of management? Okay, so she's 38 years and cervical smear shows Hetzel. Okay, so how to go ahead with Hetzel? Remember, pap smear, we have ectocervical pap smear, we also have endocervical pap smear. Okay, so now ectocervical pap smear is where we either get the report as ASC or SIL. ASC is atypical squamous cells and SIL is squamous intraepithelial lesion. Okay, so ASC is a kind of doubtful lesion and SIL is a kind of definitive lesion. Okay, so now again in ASC we have two varieties. One is ASC US, atypical squamous cells of undetermined significance, and ASC-H, atypical squamous cells of high grade. Okay, and in turn in SIL we have two varieties, L-SIL and H-SIL. Okay, L-SIL and H-SIL. Remember, pap smear is only a screening technique. Pap smear is done for asymptomatic women and pap smear is done for normal looking cervix. Okay, so therefore pap smear would not lead us to any diagnosis or any treatment procedure. Okay, so whenever you get an abnormal pap smear, this abnormal pap smear report has to be followed with a definitive procedure or a diagnostic procedure, and then a definitive treatment should be offered. And that diagnostic procedure for a normal looking cervix would be a colposcopy guided biopsy. Okay. And now here, out of these four categories, Ascus, Ascutch, Elsil and Hetzel, if you can avoid colposcopy in one particular case, and that would only be Ascus, okay, because Ascus is the mildest form of the lesion, okay. So what can you do for Ascus? For Ascus, you can follow the patient, okay. You can follow the patient. You can also do HPV DNA test. You can also do HPV DNA test, okay. And now if HPV DNA is negative, what she requires is only follow-up, okay. If HPV DNA is negative, what she requires is only follow-up. If HPV DNA is positive, she requires colposcopy, which is the diagnostic test for any underlying pre-malignant or malignant lesions of the cervix, okay. Now for all other abnormal pap reports like Ascutch, Elsil and Hetzel, for all other lesions, ideally what you should be doing is a colposcopy guided biopsy, okay, colposcopy guided biopsy, okay. So here 38-year-old patient with report as Hetzel, the next line of management is definitely option C, which is colposcopy guided biopsy. Okay, let's see the next question. Which of the following is not a component of Bishop score? Okay, Bishop score. We all know Bishop score is to assess the cervical status, to see how favorable the cervix is for progression for induction of labor. And if the cervix is not favorable for induction of labor, we'll have to ripen the cervix with prostaglandins and then induce labor. Okay, so what are the components in Bishop score? We already have this discussion in induction of labor topic in Doctutorials app. Okay, and now the components go like this. Okay, DESCO, D-E-S-C-O, DESCO is the mnemonic. Okay, so what do they stand for? D is for dilatation. Okay, D is for dilatation, E is for effacement, S is for station, C is for consistency, and O is for os, that means position of os. Okay, dilatation, effacement, station of the head, okay, station of the head, okay, consistency of the cervix and position of the os. Okay, so dilatation of the cervix, effacement of the cervix, station of the head, consistency of the cervix and position of the os. And the scores are like this. Okay, 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2 and 3. Okay, so how does it go with dilatation? The scores are like this. Closed cervix 1 to 2 centimeter, 3 to 4 centimeter, more than or equal to 5 centimeter dilatation. Closed 1 to 2, 3 to 4 and more than or equal to 5 centimeter dilatation. So 5 centimeter dilatation gets a score of 3. Okay. Next is effacement of the cervix. Okay. Effacement is usually graded in percentage. Okay. So 0 to 30%, 40 to 50%, 60 to 70%, 80 and above. Okay. So 0 to 30% gets a score of 0 and 80% effacement gets a score of 3. That's how the scoring goes for effacement. Okay. Next is station of it. Station, we usually use the landmark ischial spine as the reference point, and at the level of ischial spine it's 0 station. 1, 2, 3 centimeter above the ischial spines will take a station of -1, -2, -3, and similarly 1, 2, 3 centimeters below the ischial spine will take +1, +2, +3 respectively. Okay. So station of the head will get scores like this. If the head is at -3, score is 0, -2, score is 1, -1, 0, +1, +2. Okay, -3, -2, -1 and 0, +1 and +2. +1 and +2 will get a score of 3. Okay. Next is consistency of the cervix. Normal non-pregnant cervix is firm in consistency. Pregnant cervix is soft in consistency. Okay. So firm, medium, soft. There is no score 3 here. It's only 0, 1, 2. If the cervix is soft, the score is 2. Okay. And position of the os, Anterior os is more favorable, posterior os is less favorable. So posterior, mid position, anterior. Okay, posterior, mid position, anterior. So anterior gets the maximum score. Anterior cervix gets a score of 2. Posterior cervix gets a score of 0. Okay, so that's how it goes. Okay, so this is about Bishop score: dilatation, effacement, station of the head, consistency of the cervix, and position of the os. Okay, so now look at the options. Option A is cervical position, which is there in Bishop's. Cervical length, that indirectly is about the effacement. Length is about the effacement, that's again there. Cervical dilatation is again there. What is not there is this maternal pelvis. The details in the maternal pelvis not included in Bishop's score. Okay. So correct answer is option D. Next question here. Ideal age to start screening for carcinoma cervix. Okay. So what does the latest guideline say? Guideline says start screening for cancer cervix with pap smear as early as 21 years, regardless of the sexual history, provided she is sexually active. The duration of sexual exposure is not important. Okay, so you can't be doing it for a virgin girl. You can only do it for a woman who is sexually active, but the duration of sexual exposure, the duration of sexual activity is not important. Okay, so start at, what are the points? Start at 21 years. Okay, and between ages 21 and 29. Okay, between 21 and 29. Do cytology every 3 years. Okay, that means PAP every 3 years. Okay, between 30 and 65, you have two options. Either you can do cytology every 3 years. Okay, either you can do cytology, that means you can do a PAP every 3 years, or you can combine PAP with HPV DNA, which can be done every 5 years, and this kind of testing is called as co-testing. Okay, so if you do only PAP, you will have to do every 3 years, or if you do co-testing means PAP plus HPV DNA. Okay, PAP plus HPV DNA. If you opt for co-testing, then you can do it every 5 years. Okay, once in every 5 years. Okay, and if all the screening tests in the last 10 years test negative, then you can stop screening at the age of 65. Okay, so stop at 65. Stop at 65, provided the last 2 co-tests or the last 3 pap smears, that means between the ages of 55 and 65, if they remain normal, then you can stop screening at 65. So the ideal age to start a screening for cancer cervix is at 21. Basically here correct answer is not, but if you want me to pick one, then this should be the answer. Okay, at 21. Okay, between 21 and 65. Okay, see the next question here. A 32-year-old patient attends infertility clinic with regular cycles of 28 days. Which of the following is ideal to confirm ovulation? Okay, so 2 important points are there here in the given question. 2 important informations are there. Number 1, the cycles are regular cycles. Okay, and number 2, they only want to confirm ovulation. They're not planning for any procedure like IUI. Okay, so that means if the patient is planning for any procedure like IUI or a planned intercourse, then the method would differ. If she only wants to see if she's ovulating with every cycle, then the plan would differ. Okay, I'll first tell you what all options are available to detect ovulation, and then we'll discuss on where to choose what. Okay, so what are the methods to detect ovulation? Okay, methods to detect ovulation, they are: number 1, menstrual history. Okay, number 2, basal body temperature. Okay, number 3, serum progesterone concentration, serum progesterone levels. Okay, number 4, urinary LH. Okay, urinary LH. Number 5, endometrial biopsy. endometrial biopsy. Okay, and number 6, transvaginal ultrasound. Okay, transvaginal ultrasound. Okay, so these are the 6 important techniques available to confirm or to detect ovulation. Okay, we'll discuss one by one now, and then we'll finally decide on where to choose what. Okay, so we all know a normal menstrual cycle is a 28-day cycle, out of which the first 14 days make the follicular phase and the second half makes the luteal phase. Okay, and we also know that ovulation occurs usually on day 14 and a 28-day cycle, but it's not a constant one. Ovulation usually occurs 14 days prior to the onset of menses. That means if it's a 30-day cycle, then ovulation will occur on 30 minus 14, that will be on day 16. So, similarly in a 32-day cycle, it will be on day 18. That's how it goes. So, from this I am telling that the first half of the menstrual cycle can vary, whereas the second half of the menstrual cycle always remains constant, and it is always by 14 days. Okay. And you all know the most important hormone in the first half of the menstrual cycle which helps the follicle grow is FSH, and the one important hormone which makes the follicle mature and rupture is luteinizing hormone, which comes just prior to ovulation or 36 hours prior to ovulation, and it reaches its peak somewhere around 16 hours prior to ovulation, and that's when the LH peak occurs and the LH starts appearing in the urine, and it stays there in the peak for another 24 hours and then it tapers. Okay, so now when it comes to detection of ovulation, okay, so what all can we do? Say this is the normal menstrual cycle. It's a 28-day cycle. This is day 1 where the girl started menstruating, and say this is day 14, the day of ovulation. Okay, if this is day 14, that means the day of ovulation. This is where, okay, this is where it should be day 12, and that's when LH surge should begin. Okay, LH surge should begin. Okay, now LH surge begins 36 hours prior to ovulation. LH surge begins 36 hours prior to ovulation. Okay, and LH reaches its peak. LH reaches its peak 10 to 12 hours prior to ovulation. Okay, LH reaches its peak 10 to 12 hours prior to ovulation. Okay, and usually this LH lasts for this LH surge altogether, it lasts for around 48 to 50 hours. Okay, totally from the onset till the tapering, it lasts for 48 to 50 hours. Okay, and now what? Remember, the follicle grows with FSH, and at one point the follicle reaches its maximum size, and that is when it's ready for ovulation, and the follicle ruptures, the follicle becomes irregular and crenated, and it also releases fluid into the pouch of Douglas. Okay. Now, once the follicle ruptures, you need luteinizing hormone for the follicle to rupture. Only after LH appears, the follicle will attain its final maturation, and then it will rupture and release fluid and the oocyte. Okay. Now, once the follicle ruptures, the remaining structure, after the release of the oocyte, the remaining structure which we call as corpus luteum will now start secreting progesterone. Okay. So, progesterone starts appearing in the second half. And one important property of progesterone is to increase the basal body temperature by 0.5 degrees Celsius approximately. Okay, so increase in basal body temperature. Now, once progesterone comes into play, the endometrium becomes secretory in nature. The endometrial glands elongate and hypertrophy, and the vessels dilate, and that is what we call as a secretory change. Okay, so progesterone induces these secretory changes. Okay, and now when we want to monitor these follicles growing, we have a tool called ultrasound with which we can actually see the follicles growing. Okay, and at one point if the follicle collapses, we can assume that the follicle has ruptured. Okay, so now what are the techniques available to detect ovulation? What all can we do? Number one, we can get the menstrual history, and if it's a regular menstrual cycle, if it's a regular 28-day cycle or a regular 30-day cycle, she is likely to ovulate, because regular cycles are more likely ovulatory cycles. Okay. Secondly, we can measure the basal body temperature, because we all know progesterone comes only after ovulation, and progesterone is thermogenic in nature, and progesterone increases the body temperature by 0.5 degrees Celsius. So, if she is really ovulated, the body temperature has to increase by 0.5 degree Celsius. So that we can measure approximately after the day of expected ovulation. Okay. Next is what? You can monitor the follicle with ultrasound. Okay. Follicles gradually increase in size and at one point follicle becomes big. Okay. And that is when it is ready for rupture, and after rupture the follicle collapses and it releases the free fluid. Okay. So this can be monitored with ultrasound. Okay. So 3 techniques I told you. One is you can get the menstrual history. If it's regular, it's likely to be ovulatory. Second is like you can measure the basal body temperature. If the basal body temperature increases 14 days prior to the onset of menses, then again it is likely that there is progesterone in the circulation. That means she is likely ovulated. Okay. And the third is what? Monitor the follicle with ultrasound, and if the if the follicles grow at the rate of 1 to 2 millimeters per day and it ruptures at approximately 16 to 20 mm and the follicle collapses, then this is likely ovulation. Fourth is what? You need LH for the follicle to attain final maturation, and if LH surge appears before ovulation or 1 or 2 days prior to ovulation, when the LH increases, this LH also appears in the urine. So you have commercial LH kits, urinary LH kits, with which you can actually detect the LH appearing in the urine, and if LH appears in the urine, it only means that the follicle is ready for rupture. LH has come into play, the LH surge has set in. That's what it means. Okay. So this is one thing, LH surge. Okay. And next is what? You can do an endometrial biopsy to see if secretory change has appeared, or the last thing is serum progesterone concentration, because serum progesterone naturally increases only after ovulation. If serum progesterone increases, it means that the lady has ovulated. So these are the 6 techniques to detect ovulation. Okay. So what are the pros and cons? Menstrual history is only an assumption. It's a subjective thing. It's not always true. Okay. Regular cycles are likely to be ovulatory, but not always. Okay. So if you want to confirm ovulation, then menstrual history would not be the ideal technique. Okay. So this is not confirmatory. That's what I'm telling. Okay. Second is about basal body temperature. Basal body temperature is not the answer here. Why? Because basal body temperature increases with various conditions. It's not specific for ovulation. Okay. Basal body temperature increases with various conditions. Fine. Next is basal body temperature increases 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. Okay. After ovulation. Fine. Next is what? Basal body temperature has to be measured early in the morning. To be precise, it has to be measured early in the morning, which is cumbersome for the patient, and therefore basal body temperature technique is not a good idea to kind of identify or confirm ovulation. Okay. Next is serum progesterone test. Serum progesterone test is a good technique. It's a very reliable technique. Serum progesterone levels usually are less than 1 nanogram per ml before ovulation, and it increases to more than 3 nanogram per ml after ovulation. Okay. So less than 1 nanogram per ml indicates follicular phase, and more than 3 nanogram per ml, that means 4 and above, indicates luteal phase. Okay. So measure serum progesterone, and the serum progesterone gradually increases, and on the day of implantation, say roughly 7 to 8 days after ovulation, okay, that is when the serum progesterone reaches its peak. Okay. So this 7 to 8 days after ovulation in a normal 28-day cycle will correspond to day 21 or day 22 of the cycle. That means, say here is day 14, this is where ovulation occurs. 7 to 8 days from here. 7 to 8 days from here. Okay. So that means 14 plus 8 will be day 22. That is when the progesterone levels reach its peak, and that is the ideal time to measure serum progesterone levels. Okay. So this is a good technique to confirm ovulation, but remember, day 22 is the day of peak progesterone only for a lady who is regularly menstruating every 28 days. Okay. So progesterone measurement would be ideal for a lady who has got regular menstrual cycles. For a lady who's got irregular menstrual cycles, this would not be an ideal technique, because we do not know when the serum progesterone reaches its peak. Okay. So this is a good technique. Again, the next is urinary LH. Urinary LH is again a good technique, because for 2 reasons. Number one, LH appears before ovulation. Okay. And if you're planning for some intervention that particular cycle, say you're planning for an IUI, intrauterine insemination, or you're planning for a natural coitus, for couple awaiting pregnancy, urinary LH monitoring would be a good option because you get the clue 1 day prior to the expected day of ovulation, and therefore you can plan for the procedure accordingly. Okay, so urinary LH is also a good technique. Okay. Next is endometrial biopsy. Endometrial biopsy would not be an ideal technique because for a couple awaiting pregnancy, disturbing the endometrium in the luteal phase. You're supposed to do this endometrial biopsy in the secretory phase. Okay, so disturbing the endometrium in the luteal phase would not be a good idea because the couple are awaiting pregnancy. Serum progesterone is just a serum test which would not harm the endometrium if at all pregnancy has happened in that particular cycle. Okay, so endometrial biopsy is not done to confirm ovulation nowadays. Okay, transvaginal ultrasound again is a good option because it's safe, non-invasive. It also gives additional informations like number of follicles and the size of the follicles and all these things, and it also tells you in advance that she's going to ovulate. Okay, so for cycles where you're planning to do an IUI or timed intercourse, yes, transvaginal ultrasound is a good option. Okay, but for now, see, the patient has regular cycles and now your idea is only to confirm ovulation and you're not planning for any procedure in this cycle. Okay, you're neither planning for an IUI nor you're planning for a timed intercourse. Okay, so for this condition, I would say serum progesterone is the best option because serum progesterone is a simple blood test and she's got regular cycles. And now do serum progesterone in this cycle, say if she is ovulating, her serum progesterone level should be more than 3. Okay, usually it is around 10 when it reaches its peak. Okay, and that means her cycles are ovulatory cycles and therefore there is nothing much required to induce ovulation for her. Okay, so correct answer for this question is progesterone on day 21. Okay, progesterone on day 21 would be the right answer. See the next question here. Which of the following is not a mechanism of action of combined oral contraceptive? Okay, combined oral. So what is COC? Combined oral contraceptive is a contraceptive which contains estrogen and progesterone. Okay, it's a contraceptive that contains estrogen and progesterone. So how does it work? Basically, we know hypothalamus secretes GnRH, and this acts on the pituitary. Pituitary secretes FSH and LH. Okay, FSH acts on the granulosa cell and granulosa cell in turn secretes estrogen. LH acts on the theca cell and theca cell in turn secretes androgen. Okay, now after ovulation, the luteinized granulosa cell also secretes progesterone. Okay, luteinized granulosa cell also secretes progesterone. Okay, so now what does estrogen do? Estrogen inhibits FSH. Estrogen inhibits FSH. What does progesterone do? Progesterone inhibits LH. Okay, progesterone blocks LH. Estrogen also blocks GnRH. Okay, estrogen blocks FSH and GnRH. Progesterone mainly blocks LH. Androgen also blocks LH. Okay, and you all know without FSH, follicles cannot grow. Without LH, follicle doesn't attain the final maturation and ovulation doesn't occur. Okay, so now what? What are the other properties of progesterone apart from inhibiting the pituitary? Progesterone makes the cervical mucus thick. Okay, and that makes the cervical mucus unfavorable for the entry of the sperms. Next is progesterone makes the endometrium thin because progesterone opposes estrogen wherever possible. It doesn't allow the endometrium to grow because it opposes estrogen. The endometrium doesn't grow anymore, endometrium remains static, doesn't increase in thickness. Okay, so yeah. Now 3 important mechanisms by which they can act as contraceptive agents. Number 1 is inhibit FSH, LH, GnRH. That means they decrease levels of FSH, LH and GnRH, thereby not allowing the follicle to grow and mature. Second is what? They make the cervical mucus thick. They make the cervical mucus thick. And which component of it is responsible for this action? Progesterone. Progesterone makes the cervical mucus thick, whereas estrogen makes the cervical mucus thin and watery. Okay, so progesterone, because we're giving progesterone here right from day 1, it mainly makes the cervical mucus thick rather than making it thin. Though we add estrogen to it, the amount of estrogen we add to this combined oral contraceptive is very, very minimal, and progesterone is the one that mainly acts on the cervical mucus. Third is endometrium. I told you progesterone makes the endometrium atrophic. Okay, progesterone thins the endometrium. Progesterone renders the endometrium unfavorable for implantation. Okay, so these are the three important. Thereby, if the endometrium becomes thin, obviously there is no implantation. Okay, the endometrium is not suitable for implantation here. Okay, so these are the three main mechanisms by which combined oral contraceptives work. Okay, so see the options. Option D is delayed ovulation or anovulation. That's perfectly right. Okay, basically it's anovulation. Okay, cervical mucus thickening is again correct, meaning that's one mechanism of action of combined oral contraceptive. Preventing implantation is again correct because I told you endometrium becomes thin here. Okay, so the odd man is what? Increasing GnRH, because what happens to GnRH is actually a decrease and it's not an increase. Okay, so this is the correct answer for this question. So next question is on ectopic pregnancy. Okay, the examiner is asking you the criteria for ectopic pregnancy. Abdominal ectopic pregnancy is given by the criteria Studi-Ford. Okay, so name of the criteria is Studi-Ford criteria. Studi-Ford criteria. Okay. So what are the components in the Studi-Ford criteria? Basically, Studi-Ford criteria describes primary abdominal pregnancy. Okay, primary abdominal pregnancy means fertilization itself occurs in the abdominal cavity. Okay, that means oocyte goes to the abdomen, sperms through the fallopian tubes, sperms go to the abdomen, and fertilization itself occurs in the abdominal cavity. Okay, so if fertilization itself occurs in the abdominal cavity, okay, and it is not the tubes that are involved here, there are three important points that you should understand. That the tubes should remain normal. Okay, there should be no trauma to the tubes because it's not the tubes that are involved here. No implantation in the tube, no fertilization in the tube. Okay, so it has got nothing to do with the tubes. Okay, so tubes should be normal. Secondly, this should not have gone from the uterus. Okay, it should be a primary abdominal pregnancy where fertilization itself occurred only in the abdomen. Okay, that means uterus should also be normal. Okay, there should be no trauma to the uterus. There should be no uteroperitoneal fistula. Okay, thirdly, when you take a biopsy, the histopathological specimen should have omentum with trophoblastic tissue in it. Okay, so these are the three important components in Studi-Ford's criteria. Okay, so I'm writing it here. Number one, in Studi-Ford's criteria, remember, tubes should be normal. Tubes should be normal. Uterus should again be normal. Uterus should again be normal. No trauma to the tubes or uterus. Okay, so no tuboperitoneal fistula. No tuboperitoneal fistula allowed here. Okay, there shouldn't be any tuboperitoneal fistula. There shouldn't be any uteroperitoneal fistula. Okay, there shouldn't be any uteroperitoneal fistula. Okay, and histopathological examination, HPE, should reveal omentum with trophoblastic tissue. Okay, with trophoblastic tissue. Okay, this is about Studi-Ford criteria. Studi-Ford criteria. Okay, let's see the other options here. Spiegelberg criteria and Rubin's criteria. Okay, so what is Spiegelberg's criteria for? Spiegelberg's criteria is for ovarian pregnancy. Spiegelberg's is for ovarian pregnancy. What is Rubin's criteria for? Rubin's is for cervical pregnancy. Okay, so Spiegelberg is for primary ovarian pregnancy and Rubin's is for primary cervical pregnancy. Okay, so this is about Studi-Ford criteria. Let's see the next question here. A 26-year-old pregnant mother attends the antenatal OPD. She was on antithyroid medication throughout pregnancy. Following delivery, infant is diagnosed with aplasia cutis congenita. What is the most probable antithyroid medication associated with it? Okay. So now the answer is very obvious. The drug that is associated with aplasia cutis congenita is methimazole and carbimazole, okay. But I want you to know certain points which are related to thyroid disorders in pregnancy, especially hyperthyroidism in pregnancy, okay. So few MCQs from hyperthyroidism in pregnancy, okay. What is the incidence of thyrotoxicosis in pregnancy? The incidence of thyrotoxicosis is around 2 to 17 per 1000 live births, 2 to 17 per 1000 live births, okay. And it is not easy to diagnose hyperthyroidism during pregnancy because many of the physiological changes associated with pregnancy actually mimic thyrotoxicosis, okay. Say for example, tachycardia, breathlessness, okay, increased fatigability, all these are certain symptoms of thyrotoxicosis which mimic pregnancy, okay, physiological changes of pregnancy, okay. But if exophthalmos are present or thyroid is obviously enlarged, then you should think of thyrotoxicosis. Next is, what is the most common cause for thyrotoxicosis in pregnancy? The most common cause for thyrotoxicosis in pregnancy is Graves, okay, Graves disease. And you all know Graves disease is due to an antibody that stimulates the TSH receptors, okay. So stimulating thyroid stimulating antibodies, okay. So TSH receptor antibodies basically, okay. And now what are the adverse effects of this condition during pregnancy? What all can happen to the mother and the baby, okay? The adverse pregnancy outcomes are: number 1, increased chances of preeclampsia, okay, heart failure, okay, abortion, okay, preterm delivery, stillbirth, IUGR, and fetal hypo or hyperthyroidism, neonatal hypo or hyperthyroidism, okay. So fetal or neonatal hypo or hyperthyroidism, okay, anything can occur, okay, fetal or neonatal hypo or hyperthyroidism, fetal goiter basically, okay, high drops, very important point, non-immune high drops, okay, non-immune high drops. So thyrotoxicosis is one cause for non-immune high drops. And finally, hearing loss, okay, hearing loss. So these are the adverse effects of thyrotoxicosis on pregnancy, both the mother and the fetus, okay. So fetal effects can basically be a thyrotoxic state, okay, goitrous thyrotoxicosis, because the antibodies cross the placenta, the antibodies themselves can stimulate the TSH receptors, or it can be a hypothyroid state, okay. If not a thyrotoxicosis state, it can be a hypothyroid state because not only the antibodies but also the medications, the antithyroid medications that we give to control thyrotoxicosis can cross the placenta and they can lead to hypothyroidism. The third is what? Non-goitrous hypothyroidism, okay. So that means transfer of antibodies which are not stimulant in nature, rather they are inhibitory in nature, okay. So it can either be a thyrotoxic state for the baby or it can be a hypothyroid state for the baby, okay. So whatever it is, it has to be treated, okay. Now fine, what are the drugs of choices here? What are the drugs available and which drug is safer, okay. Now when it comes to antithyroid drugs, we have propylthiouracil, we have methimazole, we also have carbimazole, and we also have surgical management like thyroidectomy and radioactive ablation techniques, okay. Now out of which the treatment of choice for a pregnant lady is propylthiouracil, okay. So what is the treatment of choice? What is the treatment of choice for a pregnant lady? Answer is propylthiouracil, okay. Now, can methimazole and carbimazole be given during pregnancy? Answer is no, okay. See, the American College of Endocrinologists recommend the use of carbimazole and methimazole in the second and the third trimester because propylthiouracil is associated with hepatotoxicity. But according to ACOG guidelines, it is just propylthiouracil throughout pregnancy, okay. So propylthiouracil is the drug of choice for thyrotoxicosis during pregnancy, and the dose is usually 50 to 150 milligram thrice daily, okay. So 50 to 150 milligram thrice daily is the dose, okay. Now, what are the hazards with this drug? Propylthiouracil is hepatotoxic. It can also lead to leukopenia. It can also lead to vasculitis, ANCA related, that means anti-nuclear cytoplasmic antibodies related vasculitis, okay. So propylthiouracil is hepatotoxic and it can lead to ANCA-related vasculitis and leukopenia. Okay, so the pregnant lady should be monitored for all these: hepatotoxicity, leukopenia and vasculitis. Okay, and what are the hazards of using methimazole during pregnancy? Two important MCQ points you have to remember: methimazole and carbimazole can lead to choanal atresia, okay, esophageal atresia and congenital aplasia cutis. Okay, congenital aplasia cutis. Okay, and for these reasons, carbimazole and methimazole should not be used to control thyrotoxicosis during pregnancy. Okay, next is the role of surgery. Subtotal thyroidectomy, can we do? Answer is yes, if only the lady is not responding to oral antithyroid drugs. Okay, if she's not responding to propylthiouracil and if the disease is not under control, then maybe you can do a subtotal thyroidectomy, preferably in the second trimester. Okay, subtotal thyroidectomy preferably in the second trimester. Okay, last question is on the role of radioactive iodine ablation, strictly contraindicated. Okay, radioactive iodine therapy, ablative therapy should not be done during pregnancy. Pregnancy is an absolute contraindication for this because it passes to the fetus and it destroys the fetal thyroid tissue as well. Okay, and not only this, it gets concentrated in the breast and it gets secreted in the breast milk. If you do this therapy during lactation, this radioactive iodine is passed to the neonate via breast milk and it again harms the fetal thyroid gland. Okay, so this is about thyrotoxicosis in pregnancy. Answer is carbimazole. Okay, fine. See the next question. 28-year-old gravida 2 para 1 with 8 months of amenorrhea attends the antenatal OPD with history of abdominal pain, bleeding PV and loss of fetal movements. She gives a history of hypertension and she's on medications for that. What's the probable diagnosis? Okay, so C is it's bleeding PV. Okay, 8 months amenorrhea with bleeding PV. So it's a condition associated with antepartum hemorrhage. So two important conditions we know for antepartum hemorrhage is placenta previa and abruptio placenta. And the basic difference between previa and abruption is what? Previa is a painless bleed and abruption is painful bleed. Okay, several times we've discussed about the differences between previa and abruption, but still for completion's sake I would quickly tell you the differences between previa and abruption here. Okay, the differences between previa and abruption here. Okay, in placenta previa, bleeding is usually painless. Okay, here it is usually painless and abruption is a painful bleed. Okay, painful bleed. Okay, type, revealed type. Whereas in abruption we have three types: concealed, revealed and mixed, out of which the most common is revealed type. Okay, so we have concealed, that means hidden bleed, or it can be revealed. Most of the time it is revealed and it can be a mixed variety as well. Okay, next is the color of bleed. Color of bleed in previa, it is bright red because it's fresh bleed. Okay, whereas here it's dark, altered, brown or dark red, any of these. Okay, so here in previa it's bright red, in abruption it's dark brown, okay, or dark colored. Okay, next is what? Hypertension. Okay, where do we see hypertension? Previa is not associated with hypertension, whereas hypertension is usually associated with abruptio placenta. In fact, hypertension is one cause for abruption. Okay, next is height of the uterus. Okay, height of the uterus, because blood starts collecting inside in case of abruption. Abruption presents with increased abdominal size, the increased uterine size, especially in cases of mixed and concealed abruption. Okay, so here it can be increased or normal. Here it's always normal. Okay, and when it comes to the consistency of the uterus, here it is usually relaxed. Okay, it's not associated with contractions, whereas here the uterus is tense, tender. Okay, because it's an acute emergency situation, the uterus is usually tense and it is tender. Okay, so where do we have malpresentations? Malpresentations are usually seen in previa, not in abruption. Okay, malpresentations are features is a feature of previa, placenta previa. It's not a feature of abruptio placenta. Okay. So next is what? Fetal heart sounds. Fetal heart sounds are usually present in previa, whereas fetal heart sounds are absent in abruption, meaning IUD is more common in abruption. It's not a hard and fast rule that IUD should only happen in abruption. It can also happen in previa, but most of the time it happens in abruption. Okay. Next is DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation. DIC is not seen in previa. DIC is a complication associated with abruption. Okay. And the fetal parts usually are palpable in previa, whereas because of the tense uterus, tense tender uterus, fetal parts are usually not easily palpable in case of abruption. Okay. So these are the differences between previa and abruption. Now coming to this question, it's very obvious that there's pain with bleeding PV and there's loss of fetal movement, probably because of intrauterine fetal death, and the diagnosis is more in favor of abruptio placenta. See the next question here. All of the following are treatment options of PCOS except. Okay. So how to treat PCOS? So here is our next question. All of the following are treatment options of PCOS except. Okay. So we have ulipristal, letrozole, clomiphene, and laparoscopic drilling. Okay. So when it comes to PCOS, what are the usual complaints with which the lady presents, the girl or the lady presents to us? Number one, she can come with menstrual abnormalities. Okay, menstrual abnormalities. Or number two, she can come with hirsutism. Hirsutism, that means hyperandrogenic state. Okay, hirsutism or acne, and alopecia. Okay, or she can come with infertility. Okay, or obesity. Okay, so these are the usual complaints with which woman comes. Okay, menstrual abnormalities. What is the treatment? The treatment of menstrual abnormalities in PCOS is either combined oral contraceptive or progesterone only pills. Okay, to regularize the cycles, what we give is combined oral contraceptives or progesterone only pills, because when you put the lady on combined oral contraceptives, the cycle completely comes under your control and it is not under the control of pituitary or hypothalamus anymore. Okay. Next is hirsutism or acne. So what all can we use for hirsutism and acne? Again, we can use combined oral contraceptives, or we can use spironolactone. Spironolactone is an anti-androgen drug. Okay, spironolactone. Or we can use finasteride. Okay, finasteride. Okay, or we can use a topical drug which prevents hair growth called eflornithine. Okay, eflornithine. This is topical eflornithine. Okay, so combined oral contraceptives, spironolactone, finasteride, and topical eflornithine are used for the treatment of hirsutism or acne associated with PCOS. Next is for alopecia. Again, for alopecia, you can use combined oral contraceptives. You can use spironolactone, okay, anti-androgen drugs. You can also use finasteride. Apart from this, you can also use minoxidil. Okay, topical minoxidil. Okay, so these are the drugs for alopecia associated with PCOS. Okay, so next is infertility. Infertility is basically because of anovulation associated with PCOS. So to make the follicle grow, what all can we give? Okay, so why is there infertility in why is there anovulation in PCOS? That's because see, it's high LH that is seen in PCOS. Okay, because of this there is high levels of androgen and there is high level of estrone. Okay, now this estrone will give negative feedback signals to the pituitary, and thereby pituitary will now decrease FSH. Okay, so without FSH, what will happen? The follicle will not grow. No follicular growth. Okay, no follicular growth. Okay. So now what should we do? Androgens basically get converted to estrogens by with an enzyme called aromatase. Okay. So now how can you help this lady? Either you have to decrease the conversion of androgen to estrogen, or you have to prevent the binding of this estrogen to the pituitary. That means the FSH pituitary receptors. Okay, pituitary estrogen receptors, or you directly give FSH, or you directly give pulsatile GnR. So whatever is required for the follicle to grow. Okay, so basically the first step is what? Blocker, aromatase. You block the conversion of androgen to estrogen, thereby you prevent the negative feedback effect of estrogen on the pituitary, and thereby you increase the FSH level. So aromatase inhibitor is the first choice drug. Aromatase inhibitor is the first choice. The second choice drug is what? Estrogen receptor modulators. This is a receptor in the pituitary, okay? Pituitary estrogen receptor, okay? So what you can give is a selective estrogen receptor modulator, and the drug of choice is clomiphene citrate, okay? So two drugs I told you till now, one is aromatase inhibitors, example is letrozole, and the other one is selective estrogen receptor modulator, the example is clomiphene citrate. Or if not these two, you can directly give FSH or pulsatile GnRH, which makes the follicle grow, okay? Apart from these, the other methods are like supportive drugs are metformin, myo-inositol, D-chiro-inositol, vitamin D, and laparoscopic ovarian drilling, okay? So for infertility, the procedures of choice or the drugs of choice are, number one, first choice drug is letrozole, okay? Next is clomiphene citrate, next is FSH, next is pulsatile GnRH. If you're planning for an IVF, then you can go for pulsatile GnRH, okay? Basically drugs for ovulation induction. Okay, next is metformin. Metformin is a drug which reduces insulin resistance, and you all know insulin resistance is the key pathology in PCOS. Okay, so metformin definitely can be used, and it improves ovulation rates. Okay, and next is what? Inositol. Myo-inositol and D-chiro-inositol. Myo-inositol, D-chiro-inositol. Okay. Next is laparoscopic ovarian drilling, and vitamin D supplement, okay. So it has been proved that vitamin D deficiency is associated with PCOS, and it has also been proved that vitamin D supplementation improves ovulation rates and fertility rates with PCOS, okay. So the odd man here is what? Laparoscopic ovarian drilling is definitely useful in case of PCOS. Drilling is definitely useful. Clomiphene is useful. Letrozole is also useful. What is not used here is ulipristal. Okay, ulipristal. About ulipristal, we'll discuss in the app. You can see in the drugs part. Okay, ulipristal we'll be discussing there. Ulipristal is basically a selective progesterone receptor modulator, which is used for the treatment of fibroids and emergency contraception. Okay. So we'll see the next question here. All of the following structures are cut in mediolateral episiotomy except, okay. So something about episiotomy. Now number one, what are the types of episiotomy? We have the three types of episiotomy: medial, lateral, and mediolateral. Apart from these three, we have other rare varieties like J-shaped and all, which is not in use at present, okay. So medial, lateral, and mediolateral, out of which the most commonly used one is mediolateral. Supposing say this is the perineum, okay, and this is where the head is crowning, and here is where the anal sphincter is, okay. So the anal orifice is. Give a cut like this, it's medial. Give a cut like this, it is mediolateral, and give a cut like this, it is lateral episiotomy, okay. So which is, this is medial, mediolateral, and lateral, okay. Out of which the most commonly performed one or the recommended one is mediolateral episiotomy, okay. Mediolateral episiotomy, fine. And next point is, should we give episiotomy for all normal vaginal deliveries? Answer is no, okay. Episiotomy should be given judiciously. That means if only it is mandatory and required, you need to give this episiotomy, okay. And any complicated vaginal delivery like shoulder dystocia or a prolonged second stage of labor or a breech delivery or a preterm delivery, a forceps delivery, instrumental delivery is where you can use episiotomy, okay. And next is what? The advantages and disadvantages of these types, okay, medial and mediolateral episiotomy. Medial episiotomy is where you give the incision from the midline, that means the faucet, okay, to 1 to 2 centimeter short of the sphincter, okay. So it extends in the midline, and you stop it well before the sphincter, okay. And now the next is mediolateral. Mediolateral again, it starts from the faucet. It starts from the faucet in the midline, okay, runs laterally, and the angle is usually 60 degree when the head crowns, but after delivery it becomes 45 degree, okay. So it is 60 degree during crowning. That means when you give a cut it will be 60 degrees, but then it becomes 45 degree when you suture it, okay. So ideally it is planned that it becomes 45 degree by the time you suture it, okay. So this is mediolateral episiotomy. Lateral episiotomy is completely lateral, which starts well away from the faucet, okay. And now what the advantages and disadvantages of these types? Remember, medial episiotomy has got less blood loss, easy to suture, good healing, okay. But the only disadvantage is sphincter injury to the anal sphincter, okay. And if I have to talk about mediolateral, it would just be the opposite of this, okay. Mediolateral episiotomy is where there is more blood loss, okay, and it's not easy to suture, and healing is not as good as a medial episiotomy, but then sphincter is safe, okay. So this is all about medial and mediolateral episiotomy. Now last about the given question, the structures that are cut in normal episiotomy, mediolateral episiotomy. The structures that are cut are bulbospongiosis, superficial transverse perineae, and sometimes if it is very deep, possibly deep transverse perineae, and pudendal vessels, okay. Bulbospongiosis, yes it is cut. Superficial transverse perineae, most of the time it is cut, okay. Deep transverse perineae, sometimes it is cut. Pudendal vessels are cut. What is not cut is the obturator muscle, okay. Now remember, if the option D was not obturator, and if option D was deep transverse perineae instead of obturator, then I would go for deep transverse perineae, because superficial transverse perineae is more often cut. Deep transverse perineae is not often cut, okay. So this is how it is. So obturator muscle is the answer here for the given options. Next question here. Increased ESR in pregnancy is due to increase in which of the following, okay. Correct answer is fibrinogen, okay. ESR increases in pregnancy and it is due to increase in not only fibrinogen but also globulins, okay. Increase in fibrinogen and increase in globulins, okay. Also remember, all clotting factors increase with pregnancy. All clotting factors increase with pregnancy except 11 and 13, okay, except 11 and 13. 11, clotting factor number 11 and clotting factor number 13 are two important clotting factors which decrease with pregnancy. All other clotting factors increase with pregnancy, and fibrinogen being clotting factor number 1, fibrinogen shows the maximum change with pregnancy, okay, almost 50% change with pregnancy, okay. So in fact, the normal fibrinogen levels of a non-pregnant lady, okay, the normal fibrinogen levels of a non-pregnant lady is around 200 to 400 milligrams percent, average being 300, okay. And for a pregnant lady it is, remember, 300 to 600 milligrams percent, average being 450, okay. So that means 300 becomes 450, which accounts for a 50% increase in fibrinogen during pregnancy, okay. 50% increase in fibrinogen during pregnancy, okay. So this is it about this question. We'll move on to the next question here. 30-year-old patient diagnosed to be having unilateral breast cancer. She was on tamoxifen therapy. What complications to be advised for the patient regarding this medication, okay. Yeah, about tamoxifen. We'll learn some points about tamoxifen now. So what group of drug is tamoxifen? Tamoxifen is a selective estrogen receptor modulator, okay. Tamoxifen is a selective estrogen receptor modulator, basically estrogenic in some areas, anti-estrogenic in few other areas, okay. So where is it mainly anti-estrogenic? It is mainly anti-estrogenic in breast, okay. It is mainly anti-estrogenic in breast, and for this reason this prevents breast proliferation or growth of the breast cancer, okay. So used for the treatment of breast cancer. Fine. Where all is it agonistic? That's what you have to know to solve the given question. Agonistic actions. Okay, remember. Agonistic means estrogenic because it basically binds with estrogen receptors. Okay. So, decrease in antithrombin 3. Decrease in AT3, antithrombin 3. Decreased cholesterol which is normally a function of estrogen. Decrease low density lipoproteins, that's again an estrogenic function. Increase in SHBG level, sex hormone binding globulin, that's again one important function of estrogen. Okay. Increased progesterone receptors, increases progesterone receptors. Okay. Maintenance of bone mineralization. Okay. Bone formation and bone mineralization. Next is increase in the incidence of deep vein thrombosis. Okay, deep vein thrombosis. Estrogenic effects on the vaginal mucosa and endometrium. Increase in endometrial thickness. Increase in endometrial thickness and thereby leading to endometrial cancer. Okay, because of the agonistic action in the endometrium. Okay, and also remember there is an increase in flare-up in endometriosis. Okay, so there's a fourfold increase in CA endometrium. Fourfold increase in CA endometrium, and also there is an increase in endometriosis. There is a flare-up in endometriosis because of estrogen-like action. Okay. So, anti-estrogenic action, we do see this in breast. Okay. Estrogenic actions, we see with antithrombin, cholesterol, LDL, basically with lipid profile, with clotting, DVT, bones, uterus, and vagina, or all these places we see estrogenic action. Okay. So, what's the answer here? It increases the incidence of endometrial cancer. Okay. Next question here. 26-year-old primigravide with 12 weeks pregnancy attends the antenatal OPD with history of lower quadrant pain and fever. USG reveals 10 mm thick appendix and WBC 18,000 per cubic mm. So, the following is done. So, she has fever, she has pain, and she has a swollen appendix with leukocytosis. Basically, leukocytosis is a physiological change with pregnancy. It can be up to 15,000 and sometimes it can go up to 20,000 in the postpartum state, but still here the patient is symptomatic. She has fever, she is vomiting, and she also has pain, and the appendix is swollen. So, everything put together, it's appendicitis, acute appendicitis. So, how to manage acute appendicitis during pregnancy? That's the question here. Okay. When it comes to acute appendicitis during pregnancy, ultrasound usually is not that diagnostic because the position of the appendix is not normal with pregnancy. The appendix tends to move upwards because of the gravid uterus. Secondly, leukocytosis, abdominal pain and vomiting are certain things which are also seen in normal pregnancy. So, there is a confusion in the diagnosis. Okay, so for these reasons, the diagnosis becomes a little difficult. Okay, so if required, we can do MRI. Okay, CT is usually not advisable during pregnancy. Though Williams says CT can be done, Williams also says MRI is the best investigation for an antenatal mother to diagnose appendicitis. So, since that option MRI is not there here, I would not go for CT as the answer. And now, among the other options, antibiotics is a must. There is no doubt of whether to give antibiotics or not. Antibiotics are mandatory. Okay, when to open up, when to subject her for surgery? Is it after 20 weeks, the second trimester, or is it during delivery, or is it immediate surgery? Remember, morbidity and mortality of acute appendicitis increases with pregnancy. Okay, so pregnancy with appendicitis is more morbid when compared to appendicitis in a non-pregnant lady. Okay, and also remember, as the gestation advances, the risk of appendicular rupture increases. Okay, so risk of rupture is maximum in the third trimester. Okay, risk of rupture is maximum in third trimester, and though investigation of choice is ultrasound, gold standard or the best investigation is MRI. Okay. Now, regarding the timing for surgery, correct answer is immediate surgery. Okay. Antibiotics and immediate surgery, and the usual choice of antibiotic will be a second generation cephalosporin. Okay. Second generation cephalosporin is the usual antibiotic of choice. Okay. Fine. So, this is about appendicitis in pregnancy. We'll move on to the next question. Which of the following is not a component of biophysical profile? Okay, I'll tell you the components of biophysical profile here. The components of biophysical profile are, biophysical profile is otherwise called as Manning score. Manning score. Components of biophysical profile are non-stress test. Okay, non-stress test. Second is Likert volume. Likert in terms of single deepest pocket. Single deepest pocket. Okay. Next is fetal tone, fetal breathing movements, and gross body movements. Okay, gross body movements. These are the 5 components of biophysical profile: non-stress test, Likert, fetal tone, fetal breathing movements, and gross body movements. Okay, so if the non-stress test is reactive, you get a score of 2. If the single deepest pocket measures at least 2 cm, again get a score of 2. And if the tone is good, that means 1 of extension with return to flexion. Okay, so in a 30-minute observation period, at least 1 extension with return to flexion is what is required to give a score of 2. And next is fetal breathing movements. Fetal breathing movements, it has to be a continuous breathing episode for at least 30 seconds in a 30-minute observation period. The usual observation period is a 30-minute observation period, and in that you need to have at least 1 episode of breathing movement which lasts for 30 seconds. And if that is there, you give a score of 2. And finally, gross body movements, at least 3 movements, full body movements, 3 full body movements in this 30-minute observation period will get a score of 2. Okay, so the maximum scores are like 2 for each parameter. The total score will be 10. Okay, and it's like all or none. That means if the set criteria is satisfied, you give a score of 2, and if it's not satisfied, you give a score of 0. There's no score called 1.5 and all. Okay, so either the score should be 0 or the score should be 2 for any given parameter here. Okay, so it will be like the total score will be 10, and the possible scores are like 0, 2, 4, 6, 8 and 10. Scores can only fall in even numbers, scores cannot fall in odd numbers. So, this is about Manning score. Manning score is otherwise called as biophysical profile. Okay, so obviously the odd man here is contraction stress test, because what is done here is non-stress test, not with contractions. Okay, so this is it. We'll see the next question here. A 45-year-old multiparous woman incidentally diagnosed clinically with 14 weeks fibroid. The patient is asymptomatic. What is the next line of management? Okay, so this has been discussed several times, even in the app, and now I'm very clear with the answer. Remember, Williams clearly says that asymptomatic fibroids, irrespective of the size, can be managed expectantly. Okay, asymptomatic fibroids, irrespective of the size, can be given just monitored. Okay, meaning can be given expectant management. Okay, so yes, expectant management is the correct answer here. Okay, 24-year-old mother, 6 weeks amenorrhea with intractable vomiting. So hyperemesis. USG shows a snowstorm appearance. What's the next step in management? Snowstorm appearance. Okay, so where do we see snowstorm appearance? So snowstorm appearance is a feature of, yeah, molar pregnancy. Hydatidiform mole, molar pregnancy, usually complete mole. Okay, so which is more common, complete or partial mole? Complete mole is more common than partial mole. Complete mole has got higher malignancy rates when compared to partial mole, and a complete mole has got high recurrence rate when compared to partial mole. Okay, complete mole is one where there are no fetal parts, and partial mole is one where you have little of fetal parts. Okay, so irrespective of whether it's a complete or a partial mole, treatment is suction evacuation. Okay, so for molar pregnancy, the treatment is suction evacuation. Okay, fine. So, next question here. 24-year-old mother attends OPD at 6 weeks of amenorrhea with history of pain, abdomen and bleeding PV. UPT is positive. 6 weeks bleeding, positive UPT. Okay. On transvaginal ultrasound, no sac is seen, no free fluid in the POD and ovaries are normal. Okay. So listen, okay, when a lady comes with positive urine pregnancy test with bleeding PV, the usual differential diagnosis is like any form of abortion, okay, any form of abortion or a normal intrauterine pregnancy, which is not actually 6 weeks, which is not corresponding to the period of amenorrhea, but somewhere less than that, like 4 weeks or 5 weeks, or an ectopic pregnancy. Okay, especially when you don't see a sac inside the uterus, and the possibility of ectopic pregnancy is very high. Okay. Now, abortion, normal intrauterine pregnancy and ectopic pregnancy. Now, I am ruling out abortion because if it is abortion, usually there would be one documentation of a sac inside the uterus which then started bleeding. Okay. So, if it is a threatened abortion, say there would be a sac inside the uterus. If it is a missed abortion, usually there will be a sac where no yolk sac is coming or no cardiac activity is coming for the fetus. It will be like that. Threatened, incomplete or inevitable abortions are conditions where sac plus or minus yolk sac and fetal pole would appear and then the lady would start expelling it. Okay. So, since there is completely no sac and it's only bleeding, it's very unlikely to be abortion. Now, the competition goes between a normal intrauterine pregnancy where the sac is yet to appear, or maybe a pregnancy of unknown location, that means possibility of ectopic pregnancy where the sac is somewhere missed. Okay. So, now to differentiate these two, we use something called discriminatory zone to decide on how long to wait. Okay, discriminatory value of HCG. Okay. So, what is this discriminatory value of HCG? Okay, now should I wait or do something to this? Okay, now to decide on that, I will take a value of 1500 for a transvaginal probe and 6000 for a transabdominal probe. Okay, 1500 for a transvaginal probe and 6000 for a transabdominal probe. That means if I measure HCG and it is already above 1500, and if I am using a transvaginal probe, I should be seeing a sac inside the uterus. If I am not seeing a sac inside the uterus with the HCG levels of more than 1500, it only means it is not going to appear anymore. Okay, so that means if at all it's a normal intrauterine pregnancy, sac should be seen inside the uterus at or beyond a HCG value of 1500. And the same is applicable for transabdominal ultrasound with a little change in the HCG value, and the HCG now is 6000. Okay, so that means if you are using a transabdominal probe and HCG levels are already more than 6000, sac should be seen inside the uterus if it is a normal intrauterine pregnancy. And if you don't see a sac inside the uterus with HCG levels of more than 6000, then this is not a normal pregnancy, it's a pregnancy of unknown location. Okay, so that's what it says. So to decide on that, we need to measure what? HCG. Okay. So, follow up with beta HCG is the correct answer. Okay. One thing is to see the discriminatory, whether the discriminatory value has already crossed. Second is to see whether doubling occurs, because it's normal intrauterine pregnancy where HCG doubles in 48 hours, and it is ectopic pregnancy where HCG shows an increase but not exactly doubling. Okay. So, this is about the given question. Thank you all. Hope you enjoyed this. This is about the questions that were asked in the recent AIIMS June 2020 OBG questions. Okay. See you all with a new set of questions in the next session.